So 2020, 2021, the whole world kind of got turned upside down. Depending on what side of the fence you're on, I suppose, dictated your response. I was on tour when it all started to escalate. We were in Tennessee. We were in Graceland. It was the day before the travel ban was announced in America. And having a band that was comprised of people from America, Europe, Canada, we made the decision to pull the plug and come home. So how does one even begin to start talking about 2020, 2021, especially creatively? Empath was my last record. And I guess the intention with that one is that I was at a part of my life that was sort of at a crossroads, where I felt that I needed to make music that was reminiscent of certain styles that I've participated in the past, in hopes that by laying them out for myself, I could ascertain where I was creatively and where I was going to go next. Little did I know that the puzzle would end up being my next project. What tends to happen with me, as I'm sure is the case with many artists, is that your next direction is often dictated by circumstance in ways that is hard to predict. And this group of circumstances was one that blindsided us all. I had assumed that my life would continue as it had been. I would make a record, go on tour, come home, write again, rinse, wash, repeat. That treadmill would keep going. But of course, COVID came along, and here we were at home, with uncertainty underlying everything. Not only the pandemic, and of course, that craziness, all the political, social, creative, personal unrest, and the depression, and all these things. It was just, well, you went through it too. But I exist already in a tenuous industry, one that I needed to figure out a way to pivot it, to find solutions to continue. Live streams, podcasts, Twitch streams, YouTube videos, making live albums and trying to write solutions, I was trying to find ways to not only pivot the career, but also reach out to the audience. And on a creative level, I was really just trying to figure out where I was at amidst it all. Because there's usually a moment in the creative process during the demo stage where something occurs that gives you an indicator of kind of what the next step is going to sound like. But there's no way to sort of guide that. All you can do is write. Just write, in hopes that you're going to stumble across something that in some way exemplifies the emotional components of that particular period. So during this time, although I was writing a lot, nothing was really summarizing it. Because what was it? I've not experienced anything like this, and society in many ways has not either. How do you creatively summarize this? That's the goal. To try and make a musical, creative analogy for it. So then when I listen back to it, it becomes a snapshot of time that you were able to capture. And then ultimately progress from. But this was a weird period. This was a hard one to solve, creatively. High anxiety whilst in pajamas. It was an elusive musical identity. When I was a kid, ambient music was really appealing. It was more like an evocative soundscape rather than typical music. Watercolors of sound that you could use to sort of decorate your environment. It was much more suggestive, more like a soundtrack to your life than something you focus on. And to some degree, I've done records like this in the past. DevLab or The Hummer, or certain aspects of Empath or Casualties of Cool, Teria even. All these albums had aspects of my love of ambient music. So during the lockdown, I began to explore that again. And by writing in that style, as opposed to the more linear song structures, I began to recognize that that felt a lot more in line with the lack of structure in society. That's what 2020 felt like to me. A more free-floating, structureless, inhospitable weirdness that still strangely had some sort of arc to it. So I began by putting up 3 different ambient records on YouTube, Guitar Improv 1, 2, and 3. And each one became progressively more interesting to me as it started to evolve. However, by the time I got to the 4th one, it had taken a decidedly different turn. It was darker, it was stranger, it was more ominous. It was just, frankly, it just really seemed to fit. And I recognized that this was maybe the impetus for something that could ultimately summarize this period for me. So the puzzle. When it came to the music, I found myself all of a sudden recognizing that the idea of elaborately orchestrating ambient jams seemed to be an angle that I could get behind. It was a creative avenue that seemed interesting. And there's this experience that I've had with ambient music, music without form or overt lyrical content, for as far back as I can actually remember. That experience is by listening to it. By listening close, you can start to hear things in it that may or may not even be in there. Voices in the fan, like a distant symphony, exists in this ambient music the more you listen to it. Melodies, rhythms, like cloud watching. So what became really enticing to me was to listen to this 4th ambient jam and try to extrapolate those sorts of things. Bring them out more, either with a keyboard or guitar or voice. Sort of listen to these things that are hidden in the ambient music and try to make them intentional. So then the chaos ends up dictating the arrangements. And this I found super interesting. So it goes without saying that during this period, all my artists and musician friends, everyone was going through this. Everyone was trying to find a solution. And of course, a lot of us felt very isolated, socially, artistically. So I contacted a few of my friends and I said, hey, I've got this ambient music that I hear definite melodies in. If you could listen to it and then try to bring them out and make them sound more intentional, it could be really fun. It's like adding a dark outline to an existing pencil sketch. Let's add a keyboard to it, or a violin, or voice, or drums. Anything that we can extrapolate what's already there and make it sound very definite. Now, my original idea was to put it out immediately, so it essentially would become just another guitar ambient jam. If you follow me on social media, you may remember that last year I had said, hey, I've written this thing, it's called The Puzzle, and I'm going to put it out next week. But the more I worked on it, the more I started to recognize it had the potential to be a little more. So out of interest, I contacted my friend Travis Smith, who's done art with me for many years, to see if he'd be interested in just whipping up some images. Maybe something in Photoshop that acts as a visual equivalent to an ambient jam. He agreed, and I decided to send him the music so he would have something to reference while he was creating. And by doing that, he created around a dozen digital images that were really cool. They were abstract, sort of modern art, but they were in line with the music. And as is typical for me, the ideas started to snowball, and I began to see his images as a visual counterpart to something bigger. So I then purchased a piece of video editing software, put all his images in, added the ambient jam as the soundtrack, and sort of made myself a visual counterpart that I could loop while I was working on this music. So from his 15 or so images, I made what maybe is not to be considered a film, but more like a visualizer that I would play on my screen while I was working. And just over time, it was almost like a narrative began to appear. And I told Travis, okay, in your images, when I zoom in on it, this thing that was entirely unintentional on Travis's part looks like a bug there, it looks like a shark, or it looks like a person, or like cloud watching. And then suddenly I realized I had a theme. Chaos dictates the narrative. Now, when I had made this visualizer, I had done a bunch of hyper zooms on Travis's art in order to find these kind of what I considered to be hidden things. Then I started seeing the art a little different. I thought, well, they look like landscapes to me. It'd be really cool if I could have somebody animate stick people on top of them. And the juxtaposition of these real simple stick people drawings on top of these zoomed in pieces of artwork made the art look like landscapes, like really elaborate kind of terrain. And that, again, started to snowball, and I started to see each one of these landscapes as an individual world. I thought it would be cool to start creating this environment, which included different characters, different worlds, and all the artists that I had been in touch with could act as different aspects of that. So I then sent out a bunch of emails and asked a bunch of artists I knew if they wanted to be involved. Originally, I sent it out to just a few people whom I knew could get behind this theme, and people who weren't either too busy or too shattered. It was meant to be a release, fun, creative, abstract. So it was just a handful of people at first. But the instructions were very simple. Do whatever you want and send it back to me. Just ask yourself before you record anything, do you hear it in there? Is it necessary? Then send me your ideas. I would mix it, I would interpret it, and then I would send it back out to everybody. And this started happening daily. And although the fundamental musical ideas were already there, it became almost like a slow motion jam. And even though at this point it hadn't defined itself yet, it was starting to take shape. So the puzzle continues. It was just really weird music, but with a ton of participants. More and more people got involved. And then eventually, there were literally dozens of people sending me tracks every day. I would take this information, add it to the mix, and start to write. And as interesting as this was for me, it was a crazy process. The file management alone was absolutely absurd. Sometimes it would be a matter of people sending me small snippets that would start at a certain bar. Other times they would send me full files. But my idea was to use it all and not edit anybody. How do you solve this puzzle? And when I listened to it, it was all these people I cared about in one place. And when I was mixing, every time I unmuted a track, it would be like a present. However, a lot of times people would have the same idea as to where they wanted to participate, and so I would get the tracks back and there'd be 40 people who had done something completely different over the same part. And so after a while, the solution that I came up for with that would be, I would just have each person's part for a single bar, for example. It created a really complex patchwork of sound. And the visualizer that I had made, that I'd been watching during the whole time, the whole process, started to evolve on a narrative level in my mind's eye as well. Travis Smith, the visual artist, and I were in contact the whole time, kind of bouncing ideas off each other. And I told him, I've been experimenting with zooming in on your images, and it's interesting what's starting to appear. Like, look at this one. This seems to be a bug. This one seems to be a shark. This one seems to be a cliff. This one seems to be a mountain. Whatever. And I asked him in the same way as I had asked the musicians to draw out of his images those evocative things and start to make them seem intentional. At this point, I thought it would be cool to release the album as a very simple product. You know, maybe 1 or 2 page layout, a simple CD, non-mastered, whatever. But again, as is tradition, it went from a very simple idea to being what can only be described as a monumental undertaking. So I called Sony and Inside Out, who are the label I've been with for many years, and I mentioned that I was doing this. But they had expressed that they weren't interested in putting out a new full length from me until the first quarter of 2022. So if I wanted to do this, they kindly suggested that I did it independently. I wanted to make sure they were okay with that, because what typically happens is something small starts with me and then I make a mountain out of that molehill. And Puzzle was certainly no exception in hindsight. But my buddy Thomas at the label gave me the okay. He had expressed that we want to focus on the Lightwork album, which is coming out in 2022. And having something this kind of avant-garde or ambitious wasn't really in the interests of the label at that point. And that became actually very freeing, because without any obligations to anybody, the puzzle became arguably the most creatively free project I've had the opportunity to do. So I began to really dig into it, and it became increasingly more and more complex. More and more people, 50 or 60 musicians, artists, filmmakers, graphic novelists, a novelist, and the theme that in the beginning seemed to just appear as a result of watching the clouds, so to speak, of these images and this music, began to find some sort of trajectory that became very interesting to me. It became a theme that seemed a lot more universal during the pandemic, a theme of personal accountability during a period when we were arguably on our own more than ever, and how much of our decisions are informed by our bias, by our past, by our social environments. I then started making markers in my Pro Tools session in which I would jot down the names of what each section reminded me of. 80s, Miami Vice, Light Year-Sized Whale, Black Days, Chromatic Ridge, Life is But a Dream, Monuments of Glitch, just sort of evocative words. I wanted to take the opportunity that I had, being home for the first time in years, and although it was a very stressful time, I wanted to make an artistic statement, one that was absolutely devoid of any commercial obligations on an overt level, and really try and make something different. Also something that included all my friends, something that could act as a document of the pandemic era and what I was feeling during that time, and including all these other people who were also going through the same things, and do it via the internet like it had been this year. And I found it really exciting. This was an opportunity for me to really dig in to the artistic side of what this was making me feel, and potentially learn something about myself. It could be multimedia, super abstract music. It could be a film. It could be a book. It could be thematically a metaphor for facing the fear of the unknown. And it could go hand in hand with articulating the chaos and the darkness of this period, in hopes of coming out the other side of it in a better place. Finding that light that came at the end of the tunnel after going through this insane thing. Let's face it, man. This whole pandemic thing was messed up. I remember some friends listening to the puzzle at the end and saying, it's dark, it's messed up, it's chaotic, it doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, of course it is. That's what this whole period was. If you're going to reflect your environment, that's as accurate as I could get. However, I didn't want to end it there. So somewhere along the line, the idea of a film began to become very appealing. And puzzle, which started as simply an ambient jam I was going to put up on the internet, began to really evolve. A project that began as something very nondescript has become ultimately one of the biggest creative undertakings of my entire career. Is it particularly appealing music? That's hard to say. I mean, it wasn't an appealing set of circumstances that inspired it. It's dark and it has almost no form. But to me, that's what the pandemic was. So what's the theme of the film? The overarching creative question was, how do you recognize how much of your internal process is based on years of patterns that you haven't questioned, your bias, your fear, your unconscious dialogue? And then how much of your life do you become a slave to? You're a slave to your own fear. You're a slave to your own process, people pleasing. And the more I thought about it, the more I looked around, the more this theme started to be appearing as a universal trait in a lot of the artists that I knew and had worked with. And the pandemic, on some perverse level, allowed us all to sit with it because there was no place to run. And frankly, I found myself really grateful for that in a weird way. And the theme of how one makes peace with themselves and with their own mind during a period of what could be called profound adversarial circumstances struck me as a great opportunity for personal growth, because no longer was I able to sort of put aside those thoughts and just escape on tour or something. All your insecurities are laid bare when there's no place to run. So what I began thinking is that this theme could be applied to many different forms of media, through many different eyes, through many different circumstances. So the universal theme that all the media ended up being based on was, how does one come to a conclusion? How does one make a decision? And ultimately, you are not your thoughts. So I wanted everyone who was involved to give their own spin to this sort of simple theme. So if we had a graphic novel, for example, the artist making that, in this case Mark Leary, his quote-unquote puzzle, although a completely different set of circumstances, would be ultimately the same theme. And that theme is about making a decision. So what decision is it that I'm talking about? Well, that's the whole point. It's different for everybody. For me, I chose the fear of going outside, leaving your comfort zone. He chose, should I have another cookie with my coffee? It's arbitrary. And then I got a hold of a bunch of other artists, and I got a hold of my sister, whom is a fantastic artist and a great writer, and I asked her to write a book about the same theme. So what's her puzzle? What's Mark's puzzle? What's my puzzle? What's Morgan's puzzle? What's your puzzle? The idea is that all these experiences that we've accumulated in our lifetime inform all the decisions we make at any moment. It's not just a yes or a no. It's a lifetime of pain, fear, bias that inform all these decisions. And as such, are we in control of our own lives? And I started to visualize the decisions that we make as a sort of fourth dimensional shape. Almost like each person's decision-making process is unique, like a snowflake on a visual level. And all Travis's art began to appear almost like two-dimensional continents in which each one of these parts of your intellectual process plays out. And each one of these places is inhabited by a different part of your psyche. And so when all the decisions do finally come together and they coalesce into like a yes or a no, yes, I should have another cookie, yes, I should go outside. Whatever your answer to your own individual question is, how much of that is you versus a pattern that has been created? So the process of making any decision is the coalescence of all these parts of your mind, all these two-dimensional forms coming together into a unique sort of fourth dimensional shape. And solving the puzzle, so to speak, was about recognizing that pattern. So this led me to investigating different types of fourth dimensional shapes. And that actually led me to an artist, a visual artist named Julius from the Netherlands, who does fractal art. He was doing an installation in New York, and he's just a brilliant artist. He has this amazing repertoire of fractal imagery. So I contacted him, and he was interested enough in the concept to participate and to create a series of visualizations that were meant to represent the parts of the mind coming together into a decision, a visual representation of what it takes to make a decision. A representation of the internal process of one's mind making a decision. And I guess one of the reasons why that seemed to be such an appropriate topic to pursue during the pandemic is the amount of misinformation that we're fed constantly online puts us all in a position where we have to make up our own mind, where we have to make hard decisions for ourselves and our families after years of many of us taking for granted how difficult it is to function autonomously. So the next step was to try and figure out, how am I going to make a film? So, with the puzzle, trying to visualize how to make a film about this rather dense topic was a confounding process. But I had worked with a local Vancouver director named Aaron Nathanson for some of the content for the special edition of the Empath record. And I convinced him and his crew to be involved with making the puzzle film. For the animators, I contacted a couple people. DC Turner, who had done the Y video, and his buddy Ricky, who is a great 3D animator, and Julius, whom I've mentioned before in this documentary, doing the fractal art. But filming this in Vancouver during the height of the pandemic was also really strange, really stressful. Like the precautions that we were taking and just everything that was involved with it was just not a simple process. Like everything else had been this year, it was complicated. And the filming was interesting as well, because obviously we didn't have a huge budget for this. So for the main actor, I hired me. And I have to admit, I'm probably not up for any Actor of the Year awards. But it was fun. But the point was important enough for me to try and make that I went with it. But the whole idea with the media, like the different types of media for puzzle, was I wanted to have the theme represented by a lot of people, by different people. Now, all these pieces of media were coming together in a really cool way. The movie is super dark. The graphic novel is super dark. My sister's book is super dark. All these things were exactly as they were supposed to be. But I started recognizing as well that I didn't want to end this on a dark note, because that implied to me that there is no growth. So I started trying to write another piece of music on the side that would act as a sort of balm for the chaos that puzzle was making me feel, like Alien and Synkestra, The Hummer and DevLab, Ocean Machine and City, Sky Blue and Dark Matters. I've been doing this forever. It helps me creatively to have something to sort of balance out the energy of one with the energy of another. So I started writing something really beautiful in the same sort of way that puzzle had been built. I started another ambient jam, but this time with the intention of making something that people could put on if they were feeling stress, if they're feeling traumatic, if they're feeling like they have problems sleeping, something that will calm people down and make just something really beautiful that acts as a conclusion. If you were going through something that was really upsetting, I would like this record to be something you would listen to feel better. But the idea was to involve the same people who had worked on the puzzle in the same way. So this album then went out to the same group of musicians. And I started to really enjoy this one. I love the idea of not allowing that darkness to win you over. I love the idea of being able to face what we've had to face, and the conclusion, the solving of that puzzle, the recognition that the patterns internally that are creating such inner chaos are in many ways up to us to transcend. And by doing so, that was the whole point of this, is that yes, it was chaos, and yes, it was dark, and yes, it was madness. But by recognizing how much control we actually have over our own minds and our own process, then we have the chance to react to things more so than trying to control them. And so the second project ended up being called, which is the most regrettable name ever, but because it elicited such a strong negative reaction from some of the people I knew that really like heavy music, I decided that yes, I was going to call it Snuggles. And so the second record is called Snuggles, and this became a whole other thing. It became a whole other record, and then I wanted to make a film for that as well. And so the whole purpose of this project, of The Puzzle, which is now two parts. The puzzle is Puzzle and Snuggles. It's two films, it's a graphic novel, it's a written novel, it has toys, it has characters like this guy who's meant to represent the inner child that's being protected by these centuries of your ego, the guilt character, the thug, the id, the clergy, whatever it is. And so by the end of it, I decided to turn it into a complete box set. So something that could take this whole pandemic era and all the creative chaos that ensued during it put it all in one place and create a monument of this pandemic that I can look back on creatively and say, okay, this is what it was for me. Here are all these people that I care about. Here's this movie about it. Here's this visualizer. Here's this book. Here's this toy. Here's this, in the box set, we've got a video screen. I just really wanted to do this, and I wanted it to be awesome. I mean, I'm constantly sort of asked to make things simpler or to try and present things to people in a way that's more accessible. And although I do like that type of music, for sure, that's not what the pandemic was for me. The pandemic was a test for me, for all the people that I knew, for so many people that I cared about. It's an experience that I think it's really important to not forget and to not gloss over and to be in denial of how difficult it was. Because the only way we can grow is by being able to look at it and really say, yeah, this is what I learned. This is who I am. This is what came out of this. This is where my weaknesses are. These are where my strengths are. How much negative self-talk prevents us from actually taking that step? Like how much of our unwillingness to fail prevents us from putting ourselves in any position where we risk failure? It's so much easier to criticize and never try than it is to try and risk that failure. But I'll tell you what, man, the success lies on the other side of the risk of being viewed as a failure. So the puzzle was my pandemic art project. And there we go. I thank everybody who was involved. I thank you for all your participation during the quarantine concerts and the podcasts and everything. And I look forward to seeing you on tour. And now I'm actually recording a new record. The record I'm working on now is called Lightwork. And it comes out first quarter of 2022. And Lightwork is a bunch of songs. It's not an abstract record. It's a really strong, direct, more accessible record, I guess. But I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that had I not cleared the pipes of the chaos that has happened to me and to everybody I know with the puzzle. So it may not be your cup of tea musically. I can accept that. But really, I thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to do this. Holy cow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If there's anything that comes from the puzzle for me, it's just thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Take care of yourselves, all right? See you around.